September 21st, 1944. Normandy. The morning began with silence, the kind that makes men nervous. A grey mist hung over the hedgerows, veiling the fields in thin smoke from distant fires. The earth trembled softly, a low, rhythmic growl, like the pulse of something mechanical awakening beneath the soil. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Müller raised his field glasses and peered through the haze. Beyond a shattered farmhouse, the silhouettes of tanks emerged, American M4 Shermans, rolling in columns through the broken lanes near Falaise. To Müller, they looked the same as always, clumsy, overconfident, and doomed. He lowered his glasses, exhaling through his teeth. "Same old Shermans," he muttered. His gunner, Hans Weber, smirked as he adjusted the optics of their Panzer IV. "Let's light them up before they even know we're here." The Germans had a word for these American machines, Tommy Cookers, burning coffins. Every veteran at the front knew why. When a German round pierced a Sherman's armor, the tank didn't just die, it erupted. Ammunition cooked off like fireworks. Flames leapt skyward, and the crew inside had seconds before the interior became an inferno. It was a grim certainty, a mechanical law. American tanks burned. And yet, this morning, something was different. Through the binoculars, Müller noticed the way the Shermans moved slower, more deliberate, their hatches sealed, their formation tighter than before. There was a strange stillness to them, an unspoken confidence that didn't belong to men who expected to die in steel coffins. He didn't understand why. He didn't have to. All he needed was one shot. Weber took the first. The Panzer IV's 75mm gun thundered, shattering the quiet. The shell tore through the air and struck the lead Sherman square in the hull. The German crew waited for the familiar blossom of fire, but it never came. The tank jolted, shuddered, and kept moving. Its turret swung toward them with a kind of mechanical calm. The machine that should have been a furnace was still alive. "What the hell?" Weber whispered. Müller blinked twice, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. A second shot hit another Sherman. Again, no fire, no explosion. The tanks didn't burn. They advanced. Within minutes, the German position was under return fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared back, pulverizing the stone walls of the farmhouse. Müller's ears rang as debris showered the crew compartment. "Reload, schnell!" He barked, but there was hesitation in his voice now, a disbelief creeping through discipline. What neither he nor any German commander yet knew was that these were not the same Shermans they'd faced in Africa or the early days of Normandy. Inside their hulls, unseen and silent, lay the result of a transformation, a quiet revolution born not in the battlefield, but in the factory floor. These machines carried a new system, something the Germans had never imagined. Wet ammunition, stowage racks, surrounded by water-filled jackets that smothered fire before it could spread. It was engineering born from failure from hundreds of burnt-out wrecks and thousands of dead tank crews. Now, in the hedgerows of Normandy, that invisible system was rewriting the physics of survival. Müller's third round hit another Sherman, this time in the side armor. The shell penetrated, sparks burst from the impact, and again, no detonation, no flames. The tank simply absorbed the blow and kept rolling. He dropped the field glasses. His voice was flat now, stripped of confidence. "They're not burning," he said quietly. Weber glanced at him. "Maybe it's bad ammunition?" Müller shook his head. "No. Something's changed." He looked out again, and for the first time since the campaign began, the Panzer commander felt the faint pulse of uncertainty, the sense that the battlefield was shifting beneath him. What he didn't know, what no one on the German side yet understood, was that the Americans had turned their weakness into a weapon. Fire, once the symbol of their vulnerability, had become their shield. As the Shermans closed in, their engines roaring through the mist, Müller watched the familiar logic of armoured warfare collapse in real time. It wasn't the enemy's courage that unnerved him. It was their machines. The world he thought he understood, where German precision ruled over American abundance, was melting away in front of him. The Panzer's gun fired again and again until the barrel glowed red. But it didn't matter. The Shermans were still coming. Steel kept moving where men faltered. And in that moment, Muller realized something terrifying. The Americans hadn't just built better tanks, they'd built a better system. The silence that had begun the morning returned, broken only by the sound of engines, American engines echoing through the wreckage of what had once been German certainty. For years before that morning in Normandy, German confidence in their armoured superiority had been absolute, almost theological. To the Wehrmacht, tanks were not just machines. They were the purest expression of German logic steel, shaped by mathematics, discipline, and perfection. Every gear, every shell, every rivet in a Panzer Kampfwagen 4 or Tiger 1 represented an industrial creed. Speed, precision, domination. They saw warfare as an equation, and in that equation, firepower and efficiency always favoured them. In North Africa, at Kursk, across France, the pattern had held. When a German round hit a Sherman, the result was inevitable. The tank brewed up, crew and all. Flames rose from the hatch, sometimes before the turret even stopped spinning. They mocked the spectacle, calling the American tanks Ronsons after the cigarette lighter brand, with the slogan, "Lights every time." That cynical humour wasn't mere cruelty, it was doctrine. To the German General Staff, the Sherman was proof of American inferiority, an industrial toy built in haste by a nation that understood production, not warfare. At the Panzertruppenschule outside of Winsdorf, instructors even used film reels of burning Shermans to teach new crews. They paused each frame to analyze the moment of ignition, the flashpoint where enemy armor became a tomb. "Observe." One colonel would lecture, pointer tapping the screen. "Ammunition stowage along the side walls. Poor design. One hit and the Americans burn." Students laughed. The lesson was simple. Superiority wasn't about numbers, it was about engineering. To German tankers, the Sherman was an insult to the art of war. But across the ocean, inside the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, Michigan, a different logic was forming, a colder, more systematic kind. The Americans didn't worship perfection, they worshipped process. Their creed was not craftsmanship, it was correction. When a Sherman burned, American engineers didn't mourn it. They measured it. They dissected the wrecks that returned from Tunisia and Sicily, counting shell fragments, mapping burn patterns, timing how long it took for ammunition to detonate. Each loss became data. Each fire became a number in an equation that could be solved. The difference between the two civilizations was invisible to the naked eye, but it lived in the way they thought. Germany believed in mastery. America believed in adaptation. By late 1943, the Sherman fire problem had become one of the most studied technical issues in American ordnance history. At the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, engineers and officers gathered around a series of test hulls lined up like corpses on an autopsy table. Each tank was loaded with ammunition, struck by anti-tank rounds, and recorded on high-speed cameras. When the shells hit, the interior ignited in a fraction of a second. Inside one of those tests stood Dr. Richard Patterson, chief engineer of the Army Ordnance Department, a quiet, methodical man who had spent months reading after-action reports from North Africa. The numbers haunted him. Over 60% of all penetrations resulted in catastrophic ammunition fires. By comparison, German Panzers suffered less than 15%. The reason was deceptively simple. American ammunition racks were stored along the tank's hull sides, convenient for reload speed, catastrophic for survival. A single penetration could ignite every round. It wasn't just a design flaw, it was a symbol of American naivety, but to Patterson, it was also an opportunity. Then came the idea that changed everything from an unexpected corner of the war. Marine Colonel David Chen, recently returned from the Pacific, had examined captured Japanese tanks and noticed something curious. Their ammunition racks were insulated by sealed water compartments, primitive but effective at reducing fires. Chen's proposal to Patterson was simple, almost crude. Surround each ammunition rack in the Sherman with a water-filled jacket. If a round penetrated, it would first pass through the water, cooling and smothering the heat before it could ignite the explosives. It sounded absurd, but engineering progress often does. Initial prototypes were tested in February 1944. The results stunned everyone. At Aberdeen, Captain William Foster oversaw the trials. He ordered captured German 75mm guns to fire directly into prototype hulls. The tanks were hit, but they didn't burn. In test after test, ammunition fires dropped from 62% to 18%. Numbers, cold and undeniable, had done what courage never could. They had rewritten the survival odds of an entire generation of tank crews, yet logic met resistance. Implementing wet stowage meant retooling entire production lines. The water jackets added weight, reduced internal space, and increased cost. Executives from Chrysler and General Motors protested. "It will slow down production," they warned. "We need quantity, not experiments." But Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commanding general of Army Ground Forces, understood the deeper equation. He overruled them. "Better to lose time than to lose men," he said simply. By March 1944, the first wet stowage Shermans rolled off the assembly lines. Their secret was kept tight, hidden even from many of the tank crews who drove them. To the enemy, the Shermans still looked the same: green, heavy, familiar. But beneath the armor, a transformation had begun. In the German archives, no intelligence report mentioned this change. No captured crew revealed it under interrogation. To the Abwehr, the Sherman remained the same burning coffin it had always been. It was an illusion the Americans didn't mind preserving. As D-Day approached, roughly 40% of all Shermans landing on the beaches of Normandy carried the new wet stowage system, silent guardians of survival wrapped inside machinery. No one at the front line yet knew what it meant. But within weeks, on battlefields like Falaise and Mortagne, the results would become impossible to ignore. When German rounds struck and the tanks refused to ignite, confusion spread through the Wehrmacht like static through a radio line. Some believed the Americans had changed their ammunition. Others thought divine luck had shifted sides. None suspected the truth, that the enemy had simply learned faster. That was the difference between empire and system, between pride and process. Germany still fought for victory, but America had begun fighting for efficiency. And in modern war, efficiency is destiny. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that behind every Sherman tank advancing through the Norman fields in 1944 stood not a single genius, but an entire civilization of process. For the Reich, the war was a contest of men and machines of talent and courage. For America, it had become a contest of systems. Beneath the chaos of the battlefield, a rhythm pulsed the sound of assembly lines, turning belief into production, failure into improvement, death into data. While German engineers labored over perfection, polishing optics, adjusting tolerances, and worshipping craftsmanship, American engineers dismantled the very idea of perfection itself. They understood something more dangerous: that a system that can adapt faster than it fails will always win. In Berlin, the German High Command continued to believe their victory was a question of quality versus quantity. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, once wrote that the Panzer was the instrument of the German will. But by late 1944, that will was being strangled by arithmetic. Each Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours to build. Each Sherman required less than 50,000. By the time one Tiger rolled out of its factory, America had built 6 Shermans and was already upgrading the next batch. But production numbers alone don't win wars. Systems do. The wet stowage modification was a perfect symbol of that invisible war. A small, almost unnoticeable change that altered the entire balance of armored combat. In the Reich's worldview, such an innovation should have been impossible. How could a nation that built washing machines and refrigerators suddenly out-engineer the homeland of Krupp steel and Panzer genius? The answer lay not in a single mind, but in the network, a distributed intelligence that stretched from Detroit's production lines to Aberdeen's proving grounds, from the Army Ordnance Office to the smallest field workshop in Normandy. It was a civilization learning in real time, a machine made of people, information, and industrial feedback. In the early months after D-Day, German field reports began to sound confused. At 4th Panzer Army headquarters, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein scanned after-action reports filled with contradictions. Crews were claiming that Shermans were absorbing hits that should have torn them apart. He read the accounts twice, certain there was a mistake. A Panzer IV had fired 6 direct rounds into a column of Shermans near Mortain, only 2 had burned. Elsewhere, a PaK-40 anti-tank gun had struck 3 American tanks at point-blank range. 2 had continued firing. "What is this?" Manstein demanded, handing the papers to Major Hinrich Steiner, his intelligence officer. Steiner hesitated. "Herr Oberst, we believe they have changed something inside the tank, but our units haven't recovered a new model for study." Manstein frowned. "Then find one." But there was nothing to find. American recovery crews, backed by motorized maintenance battalions, scoured battlefields for every wreck. Those 2 damaged were destroyed by engineers to prevent capture. The few tanks that did fall into German hands were older models, the dry stowage, Shermans of months past. The illusion was complete. By September 1944, the Reich's once feared intelligence network, the Abwehr, was collapsing under the weight of its own war. Its agents, spread thin across occupied Europe, could barely track the Allied advances, much less the quiet evolution of their technology. Even the surviving experts in technical intelligence had been diverted to study Allied rockets and aircraft, not tank interiors. So while German officers in the field wondered why the Shermans no longer burned, no one in Berlin had the answer. The empire that had once prided itself on its scientific supremacy was now blind to the science unfolding right in front of it. In contrast, the Americans didn't celebrate or publicize their advancement. To them, the wet stowage system wasn't innovation, it was iteration. It wasn't something to boast about. It was simply the next logical step. The principle was simple. Every problem solved becomes a foundation for the next. That mindset, quiet, relentless, systemic, was what Germany never understood. While the Reich believed it was fighting a war of courage, America was already fighting a war of feedback loops. The Ordnance Department sent field questionnaires to tank crews asking how their vehicles behaved under fire. Crews replied, and factories adapted designs in weeks, not months. Information moved faster than ideology. Inside a command tent near Metz, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division studied reports from his advancing units. Losses from ammunition fires had dropped dramatically since the introduction of the new Shermans. Crews who once dreaded every hit now stayed calm. They fought longer. They trusted their machines. When asked about it, Harrison said simply, "We used to fight the Germans. Now, we're fighting the math." That math, the invisible equation of production, design, and survival, was now tilting against the Reich. And yet, across the front, the Germans continued to fight as though nothing had changed. They still believed the laws of battle belonged to them, that American tanks would always burn, that German precision would always prevail. But in war, the deadliest weapon is not the gun, nor the tank, nor the soldier. It is a system that learns faster than you do. By the autumn of 1944, that unseen system was already rewriting the logic of the battlefield, and the men inside the Shermans, once condemned to die by fire, were now advancing through the ruins of German certainty. The contradiction had begun. To the soldiers on the front line, the change appeared almost supernatural. To the engineers in Detroit, it was nothing more than applied logic. The Americans had not simply improved a tank, they had refined the very machinery of adaptation. And it began far from the thunder of artillery, in the controlled precision of factories where steel met purpose, and failure was dissected, quantified, and corrected. At the Chrysler tank arsenal, assembly lines once built for peacetime automobiles were transformed into arteries of war. Steel sheets, thick, rolled, and cut by hydraulic presses, moved like clockwork along conveyors. Sparks burst in rhythmic waves as welders sealed the armored hulls that would soon cross oceans. Above the noise hung a massive banner that read, "Build it right, build it now, build it for the men inside." It wasn't propaganda, it was doctrine. The production line didn't honor individuality, it annihilated it. Every man was a gear. Every gear fed a system. From the foreman at the tank plant to the metallurgist studying armor fatigue, every worker operated under the same invisible order. Efficiency is survival. This was the new battlefield, and it stretched from the smelters of Pittsburgh to the proving grounds of Maryland. Dr. Richard Patterson oversaw final testing of the wet stowage tanks before they shipped out. Inside each Sherman, technicians filled sealed compartments with 37 gallons of water treated with corrosion inhibitors. The tanks were pressurized, checked for leaks, and tagged with serials that traced back to the design bureau, a traceable chain of accountability that German factories could only envy. At Aberdeen, engineers simulated combat damage by firing captured German 75mm and 88mm shells into rows of test hulls. The results were documented in film reels and measured with instruments, heat, pressure, and impact velocity recorded to the decimal. The findings were startling. In one controlled test, an early Sherman ignited its ammunition 9 out of 10 times. The wet stowage version? Only once. The engineers watched the footage in silence. The tank didn't explode. It survived. And survival, in industrial war, was victory multiplied. Back in Normandy, the front-line Shermans were living proof of that data. Every tank that stayed alive after a hit meant a crew that didn't need replacement, a factory that didn't have to build another unit. Logistics chains stabilized. Training pipelines shortened. The system wasn't just protecting soldiers, it was protecting itself. This was how industrial civilization fought. By feeding on its own efficiency, turning each lesson into fuel for the next advancement. The Germans never grasped the full scale of what they were up against. A single Panzer IV required 8,000 specialized parts, sourced from dozens of subcontractors across Europe. The collapse of one supply chain, a foundry in Austria, a cable mill in Silesia, could halt an entire production batch. Meanwhile, America's logistics web was redundant, decentralized, and fluid. If a steel mill in Pennsylvania stopped production, another in Ohio filled the gap within hours. Standardization, mocked by German engineers as soulless mass production, had become a form of armor in itself. Each Sherman that rolled off the line was interchangeable down to its bolts. A crew in France could swap a damaged gearbox with parts shipped from Michigan without modification. It was an invisible miracle of synchronization, the weaponization of predictability. In late summer 1944, the Red Ball Express, a convoy system of over 6,000 trucks, began moving supplies from Normandy beaches to the front at an unprecedented rate. One vehicle every 50 yards, 24 hours a day. Fuel, shells, engines, and replacement tank treads flowed forward in an endless metallic river. This was not improvisation. It was orchestration. An empire of motion feeding the momentum of steel. Even the Germans, obsessed with precision, had nothing like it. Their convoys moved when fuel was available, when roads were safe, when orders allowed. The American convoys moved because systems demanded it, and systems did not sleep. By autumn, German intelligence finally detected a pattern that made no sense. Reports from the Western Front described Shermans taking multiple hits without catching fire. Oberst Heinz Guderian, now Inspector General of Panzer Forces, convened a technical meeting in Berlin to discuss the phenomenon. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to a map of destroyed armor sightings, "our anti-tank tactics rely on the assumption that American tanks ignite on penetration. If that assumption is wrong, we are fighting blind." An officer proposed heavier guns. Another suggested new ammunition types. Guderian shook his head. "It is not about firepower," he said. "It is about information. They are learning faster than we can react, but the Reich could no longer learn. Its supply chains were collapsing, its engineers were scattered by Allied bombings, its factories ran on slave labor that didn't understand the machines they built. The German system was fragmenting. The American one was accelerating. Inside the Third Army headquarters near Metz, General George S. Patton reviewed combat reports confirming what his tank commanders already knew. The new Shermans were surviving at unprecedented rates. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding the 4th Armored Division, briefed him. "Sir, we're fighting longer and closer. The men trust the tanks now. A hit doesn't mean death anymore. Patton's eyes narrowed. He understood the psychological value of that shift better than any statistician. Confidence, he said quietly. That's the true weapon. In war, morale is logistics of the soul, and wet stowage had just transformed it. By November, a transformation was visible even to the enemy. Captured German officers expressed disbelief that their once fatal shots no longer ignited American tanks. Some suspected new alloys, others whispered about supernatural luck, but there was no magic, only engineering discipline executed at continental scale. Every wet stowage, Sherman, was a statement of philosophy, that the value of a machine was not in its perfection, but in its ability to evolve. The Germans built icons, the Tiger, the Panther, the Ferdinand. The Americans built momentum. In the Bastogne sector during the Battle of the Bulge, the logic of this new system reached its ultimate proof. Captain Samuel Rodriguez commanded a company of M4A3E8 Shermans, the latest variant, with wet stowage and an upgraded suspension system. When the German 6th SS Panzer Army launched its offensive through the Ardennes, Rodriguez's tanks met them head-on in freezing fog. Outnumbered, outgunned, they should have been annihilated. Instead, they endured. German gunners fired again and again armor-piercing shells, slamming into American tanks at close range. But the wet stowage system absorbed the punishment. Even when penetrated, Shermans refused to burn. Rodriguez's crews stayed in their vehicles, fighting on, even as sparks showered around them. They were not fearless, they were functioning inside a design that understood their fear. It was here, amid snow and steel, that the American machine revealed its true strength. It didn't need to be stronger than the enemy, only more survivable, more repairable, more repeatable. In the wreckage-strewn forests, Oberfeldwebel Hans Weber, the same gunner who had once mocked the Shermans near Falaise, watched in disbelief as another hit failed to ignite its target. He turned to his commander, voice shaking. "Herr Oberleutnant, they don't burn anymore." The reply came coldly through the smoke. Then the war has changed. And indeed, it had. The Americans had turned the physics of destruction into an industrial equation. Every system, from the wet stowage tanks to the recovery crews, the replacement parts, the data loops, and the morale chain, was part of a single, unified organism. It was a civilization-scale feedback loop, a machine that learned from pain and then eliminated it. To the Germans, war was an art. To the Americans, it had become engineering. The fire that once consumed them had been repurposed, not extinguished, but controlled, redirected, industrialized. And that was the ultimate revelation of the system. America didn't defeat fire, it domesticated it. By the winter of 1944, even the most disciplined German officers could sense it. A slow, invisible collapse, not of territory, but of certainty. For 5 years, they had trusted their machines to dictate reality. Now, that reality was turning against them. Across the front, reports arrived at command posts filled with disbelief. The words repeated like an infection, spreading through the ranks. Shermans not burning. At 4th Panzer Army headquarters near Aachen, General Oberst Heinz Guderian stood over a stack of field reports, his face illuminated by the flicker of a kerosene lamp. Every page contradicted the principles he had built his career on. The German anti-tank doctrine, precise, calculated, absolute, was unraveling. "These statistics can't be correct," one adjutant said carefully. "Perhaps their ammunition has changed?" Guderian's reply was quiet, almost weary. "No, something deeper. Their industry has learned." The truth revealed itself not in words, but in sound, the silence that followed every German shell that failed to ignite a Sherman. On the frozen fields near Bastogne, Major Ernst Hoffmann commanded a Jagdpanzer IV unit tank destroyers built to exploit the Sherman's weakness to internal fires. His crews had once fought with grim confidence, knowing that one good hit meant the end of any American tank. But this winter, that assurance had vanished. One of Hoffmann's gunners, a 9-year-old conscript, stared through the gun sight and whispered, "They don't die like before." It was true. The new Shermans heavier, colder, modified absorbed punishment and answered with discipline. Their shots came slower, but steadier, more deliberate. After every exchange, Hoffman's crews watched for the telltale bloom of black smoke that used to signal victory. But only frost and fog returned the stare. "Reload," Hoffman ordered, though he knew the truth. They were firing into a system, not a tank. Back in Berlin, the illusion of technological superiority was fracturing. The Abwehr's intelligence division, once the envy of Europe, now produced reports that contradicted themselves. Captured tanks revealed nothing, captured crews said less. The Americans had managed what the Germans thought impossible, a secret hidden in plain sight. No code name, no breakthrough weapon. Just a change in engineering so practical, so unglamorous, that it slipped beneath the Reich ideological radar to a regime obsessed with grandeur Wunderwaffen, supertanks, jet bombers, vengeance rockets. The idea that victory could come from a water jacket was almost offensive. The Germans kept searching for a new superweapon. The Americans kept building systems that worked. By January 1945, morale within the Panzer divisions began to fray. Veteran gunners, once symbols of precision and control, found themselves hesitating not out of fear, but doubt. Every engagement became a question. Every hit that failed to burn a Sherman was a blow to faith itself. "We're firing at ghosts," one Panzer commander wrote in his diary. "The Americans advance as if our shells are made of air." In the chaos of retreat, soldiers whispered rumors that the enemy's tanks were protected by new alloys, by flame-proof chemicals, even by divine protection. But what truly haunted them was the possibility that the enemy simply understood the war better. In February, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, who had once dismissed reports of the indestructible Shermans, sent a desperate memorandum to Berlin. Request immediate technical investigation into enemy armor survivability. Current anti-tank doctrine obsolete. The response from High Command was bureaucratic, detached. Resources unavailable. Focus on immediate tactical matters. That single sentence marked the quiet death of the German war machine. Not the loss of a city, not the surrender of a division, but the refusal to learn. By March, the American advance had become a rhythm: tanks, trucks, pipelines, repair depots, each part of a vast industrial pulse moving eastward. German gunners like Hans Weber, once proud hunters, were now reduced to survivors. He fired his last shell into the flank of a Sherman outside Cologne and watched the round punch through the armor, only for the tank to keep moving, turret turning like an eye locking onto him. He didn't even reload. He just watched as the inevitable closed in the realization that the machines he had mocked now obeyed a higher logic. "Sie haben es gemeistert," he whispered. "They've mastered it." When American infantry arrived hours later, they found Weber's Panzer abandoned, its engine still running. Meanwhile, in Allied command tents, engineers and officers pored over data instead of trophies. Every engagement became a study. Every destroyed tank was charted, every surviving one catalogued. Colonel Bruce Clark called it war by adjustment. The Germans called it madness. But it worked. The Americans were no longer reacting to the battlefield. They were rewriting it. The wet stowage system had started as a small technical fix, a way to stop tanks from burning. But its consequences rippled outward, reshaping tactics, psychology, and production itself. Crews fought more aggressively. Commanders planned deeper thrusts. Factories gained time. And somewhere inside that mechanical chain of cause and effect, fire, once an enemy, had become a weapon of civilization. In the final weeks before the Reich collapsed, Guderian wrote one last memorandum. "We underestimated the enemy's capacity not for innovation, but for iteration. They build, they burn, they build again, each version closer to perfection. This is not improvisation, it is evolution." When he finished, he set the pen down and stared at the paper for a long time, before adding one final line. "Perhaps we lost not to their tanks, but to their method." And so the myth of German invincibility, the precision, the mastery, the arrogance of superiority dissolved under the weight of a system that never stopped learning. The battlefield had changed shape. Victory no longer belonged to those who built the strongest weapon, but to those who built a structure capable of constant correction. In 1945, The war's outcome was no longer a question of courage or faith. It was a matter of throughput, of feedback, of civilization's ability to engineer its own survival. The Sherman had become something far greater than a tank. It was the embodiment of an idea that in the industrial age, fire could be tamed, studied, and redeployed not as destruction, but as design. In the aftermath of the war, historians wrote that the Allies had triumphed through production, through numbers. But numbers alone do not explain how a machine once mocked as a burning coffin became the symbol of a civilization's endurance. The truth ran deeper into the logic of how America, and by extension, the modern industrial world understood power. For Germany, the tank had always been a statement of identity. A Panzer was the embodiment of will, of discipline and hierarchy, a tool sculpted to reflect the precision of the state itself. Each Tiger that rolled off the line was not merely a vehicle, it was a monument to a philosophy that believed perfection could defeat entropy. To the Americans, the Sherman was never perfect. It didn't need to be. Its strength was not in its armor or its gun, but in the system that built it, repaired it, and learned from it. Where Germany worshipped the masterpiece, America worshipped the process. The difference between those two beliefs was the difference between a dying empire and a living civilization. The German engineer, built to conquer. The American engineer, built to continue. Every time a Sherman was lost, it taught its successor how to survive longer, how to fight smarter, how to adapt faster. The wet stowage system was not genius, it was humility turned into engineering. It came from admitting failure, then designing the failure out of existence. This was the quiet revolution of the 20th century. Not the creation of perfect machines, but of machines that could evolve within their systems. And in that evolution, something profound occurred, a shift in the moral center of war itself. At the end of the 19th century, nations had still believed that war was an expression of character, courage, leadership, will. By 1945, that belief was obsolete. War had become an expression of civilization's capacity to organize reality. Fire, the oldest force of chaos known to mankind, the same fire that had once consumed American tanks, had been turned into a regulated element inside a closed system. What once symbolized destruction had become a component of structure. It wasn't just that the Shermans no longer burned. It was that the Americans had learned why they burned and built a world where that could not happen again. That is the essence of industrial civilization. Not to conquer the world through violence, but to control it through understanding. The wet stowage system may have saved thousands of tank crews, but its real legacy was philosophical. It represented a new definition of strength, one that replaced domination with endurance, glory with feedback, and faith with data. Germany's downfall was not a tragedy of courage. It was a failure of learning. They believed war could still be won by the exceptional. America had discovered it could only be won by the collective, by a structure that learned faster than it broke. When the fires of Europe finally dimmed in May 1945, the Shermans rolled through the ruins, chipped, scarred, dented, but functional. Behind them trailed not just victory, but a philosophy that would define the post-war world, that technology, when scaled and disciplined, could overcome the limits of human frailty. In Detroit and Chicago, the same assembly lines that had built tanks were already being retooled to produce automobiles and appliances. The logic of war iteration, precision, feedback, had quietly merged into the logic of peace. The world that emerged after the war was not built by generals, but by engineers who had learned that survival depended on systems. The lesson was clear. In the age of machines, civilization's real battlefield is the factory floor. It is easy to romanticize victory, to speak of bravery, leadership, or destiny. But the victory of the Shermans was not romantic. It was procedural. Their triumph lay not in any single battle, but in the invisible chain of cause and effect that turned disaster into design. And perhaps that is why the image of a tank that no longer burned remains so haunting. Because it symbolizes more than technology, it symbolizes a species learning to engineer its own survival. In the long arc of civilization, the shift from fire to system is irreversible. From the moment the Americans filled their ammunition racks with water, they declared a quiet truth. that the power to control destruction is the highest form of creation. The Germans had fought for mastery. The Americans had fought for resilience. And in the end, resilience is what endures. The wet stowage system was not a marvel of invention. It was a symbol of what happens when a civilization stops worshipping genius and starts trusting process, when it learns that the future belongs not to those who build the strongest weapon, but to those who build the strongest pattern. That was the real weapon of the Allies. Not steel, not fire, but the ability to turn error into evolution. And that, above all else, is what made the fire their ally. June 1945, the war was over, but the machines still breathed. In the storage yards of France, rows of Sherman tanks stood silent under the rain, engines cold, paint scarred, their hulls pocked with the impact of war. Some were burned-out shells, others still smelled faintly of oil and iron. Yet together they formed something greater than the sum of their steel, a monument to adaptation. In a quiet corner of one such yard near Reims, a Sherman named Ohio Belle rested with her hatches open. She had survived 7 direct hits during the winter campaign. Her interior was streaked with rust, and her water jackets, the same system that had saved her crew again and again, still glistened faintly. A young maintenance officer approached, clipboard in hand. He was there not to salute her, but to study her. He ran a hand along the hull, then scribbled notes for a new report. Ammunition compartment, intact. Crew survived. System functioned as designed. There was no ceremony, no sentiment, only continuation. Across the ocean, in Detroit, the assembly lines were already slowing, shifting from tanks to tractors, from armor to automobiles. The same machines that had once forged fire into steel were now forging peace into metal. But the rhythm remained the same, the measured pulse of pistons and hammers, the hum of a civilization that had learned how to convert chaos into order. The engine, literal and metaphorical, had replaced the hero, and that was perhaps the quietest revolution of all. In the ruins of Germany, captured officers sat through interrogations with the stunned calm of men whose universe had collapsed without warning. During one such session in June 1945, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, the officer who had once dismissed reports of fireproof Shermans, faced an American intelligence officer who asked the same question every German engineer dreaded. When did you realize your assumptions were wrong? Von Manstein paused. He spoke slowly, the weight of a lost empire in his voice. When our best gunners began to fear the machines they used to mock. When we learned that the Americans had solved the problem, we thought unsolvable not by brilliance, but by system. He looked down, then added quietly, "We lost the war the day we stopped believing that small problems mattered." The officer said nothing. He didn't have to. Months later, Dr. Richard Patterson, the engineer whose idea had driven the wet stowage revolution, completed his final report. It was 312 pages of data, diagrams, and field statistics. A cold, methodical summary of how water and steel had saved over 2,000 American lives. No grand speeches, no victory parades, just numbers. But in those numbers lay the proof of something profound, that the future of civilization would belong to those who could turn human suffering into feedback and build against it. Years passed. The Shermans were melted down, rebuilt, reborn as tractors, bridges, and engines of peacetime. Yet one tank, Staff Sergeant O'Brien's M4A3E8, the same that had survived multiple hits during the Ardennes, was preserved. It now sits in a museum, quiet beneath fluorescent light. Visitors run their hands over the steel. Few notice the sealed compartments welded along its floor, the water jackets, the hidden lungs that once turned fire into protection. The placard beside it reads simply, M4 Sherman. Standard American medium tank, equipped with wet ammunition stowage, 1,944. No fanfare. No explanation of what that meant. But if you listen closely, standing in that still room, you can almost hear it, the faint mechanical echo of a civilization breathing through its machines. Because history is not written by heroes alone. It is written by systems that endure. The Germans believed the tank was an extension of the will. The Americans discovered it could be an extension of the mind. And somewhere between those two philosophies, the world changed forever. The Shermans did not end the war by being perfect. They ended it by refusing to die the same way twice. That is the echo that lingers, not the roar of engines, but the quiet rhythm of learning. A rhythm that still drives every factory, every design, every civilization that rises from the ashes of its own mistakes. Because in the end, the secret was never in the armor, or the gun, or even the water inside the hull. The secret was in the system that turned fire into knowledge, and knowledge into survival.